This is lecture number 89 in the ABCs of Communism series that accompanies, in this case, it's going to be accompanying volume 6 on communism in Arabia and Africa when it appears this summer. Our subject this morning is primitive communism to slavery in Mesopotamia. And in the process of getting ready for this particular lecture, I bought this book, New Light on the Most Ancient East by V. Gordon Childe, because it reminded me that 50 years ago, or more actually, when I first started studying this matter, this was one of the basic textbooks. This is the second edition of it. It was written in 1936. And in the subsequent years, since 1936, the amount of archaeology that's been done in the, 8 decades is enormous. And what I'm trying to do this morning is boil it down so that we can see what the most important stages were, because we have already covered China and in the old world, and now we're going to cover which is the equivalently early civilization, if not earlier. Civilization, by the way, means slavery. And then next lecture we're going to go to the Nile, which is only a little over 1,000 miles by road, depending on which road you take, assuming you could get out of Iraq, since the U.S. can hardly get to the airport from its headquarters in downtown Baghdad. But at any rate, if you could drive all the way, and there is a road, it's a little over 1,000 miles. That's now. That's in the most straight line. There's another way of taking roads. It's about 2,000 miles. But at any rate, in this time, when we're first looking at the farmers who occupied the hilly flanks of Southwest Asia about 12,000 years ago, if you wanted to get to the Nile, you'd have to go all the way up to the Mediterranean on the Tigris and Euphrates, walk clear along the coast to the mouth of the Nile, where Alexandria is today, and then come up to Cairo. And so you're talking thousands of miles. And the point is, these are two completely separate areas, even though in a certain sense they look like they're relatively close together on the globe. They're not. So in our lecture today we're going to be talking about Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, and the immediately neighboring regions of Iran and Syria and Turkey. But mostly we're going to be talking about Iraq. Now, the prehistoric inhabitants of Southwest Asia's hilly flanks had a choice to make when the great environmental change accompanying the end of the Pleistocene's last ice age set in. One choice was to follow the old easy way of doing what they had always done before, and the other path would be to stay in place and intensify the agricultural mode of production by professional specialization. The people we are concerned with now chose the hard way of staying in place and further professionalizing their agriculture, and as a consequence they were unknowingly on the road to slavery. Along this shining path, the people evolved socio-culturally from the tribal agricultural stage into simple chiefdoms. We know them archaeologically as the pre-pottery Neolithic A. It dates from 12,000 to 10,700 BP, and it was unknown in Professor Childe's time when he wrote this book, New Light on the Most Ancient East. Now, this is the late Neolithic period of farming villages in Upper Mesopotamia when containers were introduced and stone vessels and whiteware were still being used. From 9,000 to 8,700 BP, pottery vessels were still very few in number in these early settlements. At that time, pottery had a mainly mineral temper, and experimentation was happening with plant fiber tempering. Now, in the technical literature, I go through a section here I'm going to skip in our discussion this morning because it's mostly for those of you who are reading the original text, and you'll see the equivalent terms that are used by various authors. We want to get up to this point right here where we talk about by 8,000 BP, people had moved into the foothills, that is the Piedmont of northernmost Mesopotamia, where there was enough rainfall to allow for dry agriculture in some places. Now, these were the first farmers in northernmost Mesopotamia, and they made what's called Hasuna-style pottery, which has a cream slip with reddish paint and linear designs. These Hasuna people lived in small villages and little hamlets ranging from 2 to 8 acres. Now, this is the simple chiefdom stage, this Hasuna Neolithic. It's a Neolithic archaeological culture in northern Mesopotamia dating from 10,700 years ago. It's named after the type site of Tel Hasuna in Iraq. Other sites where Hasuna material has been found include Tel Shemshara and at Tel Hasuna, adobe dwellings built around open central courts with fine painted pottery that replaces earlier levels with crude pottery. Now we have hand axes, sickles, grinding stones, bins, baking ovens, and numerous bones of domesticated animals, all of which reflect a settled agricultural life with some animal husbandry. Female figurines made by shamans show animism and animatism evolving as an ideology, and are found in association with jar burials within which food was placed, related to their belief in some kind of afterlife. The relationship of Hasuna pottery to that of the site of Jericho proves village culture was becoming widespread. Now, toward the middle of this period, people developed socio-cultural ranking. That began in what is archaeologically known as the pre-pottery Neolithic B, from 10,700 BP to 8,800 BP. Now, in that period, there were serious internal schisms forming as a result of inequality, favoring some ranks over others. And this led to the most ancient enemies of primitive communism, that is, envy, jealousy, and coveting, emerging. What was needed was a unifying ideology that preached the giving over of more authority to the central planners. And indeed, it would come in the form of the on-end cult. And of course, we've already discussed this in Mexico and Peru and China. It's the same exact process here in Mesopotamia. In ancient Samarra, that is, the remains of prehistoric Samarra, were first excavated between 1911 and 1914 by the German archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld. Samarra became the type site for the Samarra culture. And since 1946, the notebooks, letters, unpublished excavation reports, and photographs that he made have been in the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Now, Samarra began as an advanced theocratic chiefdom, an ATC. In other words, it was the second chiefdom in the transitional stage between primitive communism and slavery. It evolved into a class-divided, state-organized Near Eastern city, lasting from 7,500 years ago until it collapsed due to internal class war 5,900 BP. As a city, it was refounded thousands of years later, that is 2,690 BP, as a fortified city on the Tigris and the opposite modern Samarra. But ancient Samarra and this refounded city and the modern Samarra are found in two different places. At any rate, now we come to ancient Halaf, H-A-L-A-F. Tel Halaf is an archaeological site in the Al-Hasaka Governorate of northeastern Syria, near the Turkish border, just opposite Selanpinar. It was the first kind of a Neolithic culture, subsequently dubbed the Halaf culture, that was characterized by glazed pottery, painted with geometric and animal designs. And that site began to be occupied 8,000 years ago. Generations of inhabitants then passed from their tribal agriculture through the simple chiefdom stage and confronted the same needs for a central unifying authority as people have in every other area we have discussed. Evidence for the emergence of this religion was found during the excavation of Max von Oppenheim from 1911 to 1913. He had found the ruins of the town of Guzana. Most important for us are the large statues and bas-reliefs of what von Oppenheim called the Western Palace, built by King Kapara, as well as proto-on-end cult room and tombs. The pottery is of the Neolithic Halaf culture type, so we see that this ATC evolved directly from the earlier simple chiefdom, At the time, this was the oldest painted pottery ever found, and together with those discovered at Samarra, constitute the ceramic complex of northern Mesopotamia. Then World War I interrupted the research of von Oppenheim, and he was gone for a few years while that thing was fought out. So now we come to the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage of the Ubaid period from 8500 to 5800 BP. In the north, the period runs only between about 7300 and 6300 BP and had been preceded by the Halaf and the Halaf-Ubaid transitional periods that we just discussed. In the south, the type site for the period is Tel al-Ubaid, where Henry Hall conducted the first large-scale excavation of the Ubaid period. Leonard Woolley eventually succeeded Hall as chief investigator. The Ubaid runs from about 8500 to 5800 BP in South Mesopotamia, where the Ubaid is the earliest known period on the alluvial plain. Undoubtedly, earlier archaeological remains exist that are now obscured under the alluvium. At any rate, funerary evidence proves increasing social stratification and is witness to the rise of an elite class of hereditary theocratic chiefdoms. These theocrats began as consigliori due to their being heads of kin groups that later administered the temple shrines and their granaries. Theocracy replaced the remnant democracy of primitive communism of the simple chiefdoms, itself a holdover of the stage of tribal agriculture. Now, archaeologically, the Ubaid period is divided into 4 phases. Ubaid 0, sometimes called Ueli, from 8500 to 7400 BP, is the earliest Ubaid phase, first excavated at Tel el-Ueli. Ubaid 1, sometimes called the Eridu phase, is named for the city of Eridu that lasted from 74 to 6700 BP. As a phase, it is so far limited to the extreme south of Iraq, on what were then the shores of the Persian Gulf. The phase name comes from the Samarra culture to the north that had the first permanent settlements south of the 5-inch rainfall isohyet line. These people pioneered the growing of grains in extreme aridity, thanks to the high water tables of southern Iraq that enable its first irrigation system. And then we have Ubaid 2 that dates from 6800 to 6500 BP. The phase name comes from the type site of the same name, and here we have extensive canal networks supporting big towns. And this system of irrigation agriculture first appears at Choga Mami that existed between 6700 and 6600 BP. Irrigation now required collective centralized coordination of labor that was provided by the theocrats. And then we have Ubaid 3/4, interchangeably called Ubaid 1 and Ubaid 2, from 6500 to 6000 BP, that saw intense and rapid urbanization of the Ubaid culture spreading into northern Mesopotamia, and where it was adopted by the Halaf tribal agriculturalists. And simultaneously, Ubaid artifacts spread along the Arabian littoral. This diaspora was ostensibly religious and supported the accompanying spread of trade from the Mediterranean coast to Oman. The earliest evidence for sailing has been found in Kuwait, indicating that sailing was known in the Ubaid 3 period. In summary, theocracy spread from Eridu, and with it came the Ubaid material culture from the middle of the Tigris and Euphrates to the shores of the Persian Gulf. The new An religion then spread down past Bahrain to the copper deposits at Oman. The archaeological record shows that Arabian bifacial Ubaid period came to an abrupt end in eastern Arabia and the Oman Peninsula at 5800 BP. This was just after the phase of lake lowering and the onset of dune reactivation. At this time, increased aridity led to an end in semi-desert nomadism. There was no human presence in the area for 1,000 years, and in the literature this temporal gap is called the Dark Millennium. The Ubaid ATC period provides a picture of a tripartite socioeconomic settlement pattern. 1. An intensive subsistence peasant farmers with crops and animals. Secondly, tent-dwelling nomadic pastoralists dependent upon their herds. And thirdly, hunter-fisher folk on the Arabian littoral, providing wild animal protein and living in reed huts. As with all ATC societies, the Udaid expansion featured the spread of a unifying religion that legitimized increasingly powerful ruling ranks. Archaeologically, we see many autochthonous manifestations of appropriated superficial elements of Ubaid material, culture, and locally distinct expressions. Now, the first phase of the stage of slavery comes in the Uruk period, 6400 to 5100 BP. The Uruk period runs in those years, and it's an archaeological periodization that means from the Chalcolithic to the early Bronze Age of Mesopotamia. That further means from the prehistoric to the protohistoric in local terms, as some parts of Mesopotamia had writing and others did not. As you can see, it follows the Ubaid period, and as you will soon see, it is succeeded by the second phase of the stage of slavery we in archaeology call the Jemdet Nasser period. The Uruk period name comes from the Sumerian city of Uruk. An important diagnostic of the Uruk period was the emergence of urban life in Mesopotamia, what V. Gordon Childe called the urban revolution that gave rise to the slave stage of Sumer. Now, the late Uruk period, that is from the 34th to 32nd centuries BC, saw the emergence of Cuneiform Script and corresponds to the early Bronze Age. As protohistoric in part, it may also be called the Proto-Literate period. Further archaeological diagnostics are 1. The decline in painted pottery, 2. The beginning use of copper tools alongside stone tools, and 3. The introduction of cylinder seals. These innovations are the archaeological manifestations of socio-cultural turning points in the history of Mesopotamia. Now, the Uruk period featured the transformation of social ranks into social classes, with differential access to the means and articles of production legalized. The appearance of the potter's wheel is partial proof of the professional specialization of ceramic production by a rank of specialists. Cuneiform Script is partial proof of writing as another professional specialization. And now we have the appearance of permanent bodies of armed men as police and soldiers, and that is the very definition of the state. Thus we impose clarity on the emergence of master-slave relations. From Neolithic tribal agriculture as the final stage of the primitive communist era arose the simple chiefdom, and then the advanced theocratic chiefdom transitional stages of the Ubaid period. Key developments in the history of the ancient Near East are mainly in its center, that is, Lower Mesopotamia. Then the focus enlarges to sites in neighboring regions to include sites of the late Uruk period. That is the time that the most rapid change took place. The 4th millennium BC witnessed the appearance of new metal tools transforming the economic sphere. For example, although copper was known, it only came into widespread farming use at this time. The use of these new tools was intended by the theocrats to step up production, and the concomitant social change to class division and ruling class use of the state apparatus to impose and enforce slavery. Now, ATC agriculture. The innovations collectively are referred to as the Second Agricultural Revolution, the first being the Neolithic Revolution. The first group of developments took place in the field of cereal cultivation, and these were followed by the invention of the wooden plow, called an ard, A-R-D, pulled by a donkey or an ox, by around 5000 BP. The ard enabled the creation of long furrows in the earth. These made work in the sowing season much simpler than previously, when this work had to be done by hands with tools like the hoe. The harvest was made easier after the Ubaid period by the widespread adoption of terracotta sickles. That is, terracotta being hard clay, formed into sickles that are placed on a stick of some kind and used to cut down the cereal stalks. Irrigation techniques improved in the Uruk period This complex of ATC inventions produced a new agricultural landscape in lower Mesopotamia. Long rectangular fields were suited for being worked in furrows, and each field was bordered by a little irrigation channel that replaced the earlier basins irrigated laboriously by hand. By 6000 BP, tree crops were also developed in the whole Middle East. In lower Mesopotamia, the date palm began to be cultivated, and gardens and orchards containing them became a characteristic element of Mesopotamian architecture. By 4,000 years ago, the trees combined with the new irrigation system allowed better rations for workers heretofore consuming primarily barley. Now we come to the subject of the cost of labor. Through the Ubaid period, the category or quality we call the cost of labor was quantified in a variety of ways. Dawn to dusk, socially required corvée dues, and the cost of subsistence for the unfree, prisoners, captives, self-sold slaves. The lowest common denominator was the latter, the cost of the unfree. Having established the legal category of unfree labor, it was a hop, skip, and a jump to slave labor and the cost of feeding, clothing, and housing the slave. Within that category, further subdivisions would eventually include family members of a given slave, dependent upon sex and the character of the legal ownership. Nevertheless, the essential economic point is that there is a category or quality called the common denominator of the cost of labor. This is what history is all about by 6,000 years ago and continues that way to the present day. End of story. In fact, this is the very first point Adam Smith makes in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, namely, that it's more economical to pay for the labor of free workers than it is to pay for the cost of keeping slaves. With a proletarian, you pay him for his labor and say goodbye. With the slave, you have to pay for his food, housing, and clothing all the year long. That is the basis of Smith's theory of capitalism. The Uruk city and its empire. A city was formed when two small Ubaid settlements merged. It was named Uruk. Remnant temples of the two Ubaid towns became the cores of the Iana River district and the Anu Terrace district. The ATC ideology carried over these temple complexes, at least to the degree that they were dedicated to the goddess Inanna and the god of gods, Anu, respectively. These temples had been the center of a unifying religion in Ubaid ATC times. As class dictatorship society emerged, the two temples were used as a unifying feature of the slavocrat capital city. The Anna district was composed of several buildings with spaces for workshops, and it was walled off from the city. The Anu district was built on an ancient terrace with a temple at the top. They served as redistribution centers for the dictatorship in building a degree of public support and were visible for long distances. I would urge you to take a look on YouTube or Google it. Take a look at the picture of these two temples in the surrounding area. You'll see what I mean. The original city of Uruk was situated southwest of the ancient Euphrates River, now dry. The rest of the city was composed of typical courtyard houses, grouped by profession of the occupants in districts around Iana and Anu. Uruk had a canal system that has been described as the Venice in the desert. Canals flowed throughout the city, connecting it with the maritime trade on the ancient Euphrates River, as well as the surrounding agricultural belt of farming villages and fields. Uruk went through several phases of growth, from the early Uruk period, 4000 to 3500 BC, to the late Uruk period, 3500 to 3100 BC. In its time, Uruk was by far the biggest city of the Western world, Old World, with at least 70,000 inhabitants. The economy of slavery. With the onset of the Uruk period, the common denominator of the cost of labor was the subsistence cost of the human slave. The free peasant farmers would be paid for their produce according to the pay scale the masters and mistresses of society established based on the common denominator, that is, the cost of slave labor. The material and technical resources of Uruk agriculture were relatively fixed costs. The cost of peasant farmer labor was the main squeezable variable, as was the cost of the agricultural specialist produced tools. Landless peasants were available for agriculture based on labor paid by the new common denominator of the slave stage. Family farm income had been reduced to the common denominator cost of slave-run latifundia. This was the original sleight-of-hand theft of slave stage economics. Its mature form would come in the form of the theft of the surplus value created in capitalist factories. That would take another 6,000 years to appear, and only after the invention of the 5 essentials of true capitalist production we discussed in Volume 1. However, the professional specialist workshops of the Uruk period were germinals of capitalism. Family farms remained the basic structural unit of villages. However, without their inhabitants really understanding what was going on, farmers as a class were impoverished. Now, one way out might have seemed to them for the family farm to have more hands. This would have led to population increase. Nevertheless, while alleviating the reduced income problem for a generation or two, the small farmers' subsistence requirements continued to grow inexorably as a result of having a number of hands per family unit. Now, as for animal husbandry, the Uruk period witnessed the domestication of the donkey. It was the first domesticated equid in the region and became the most important beast of burden in the Near East. Then the dromedary camel was domesticated by 4500 BP. With the high transport capacity of donkeys, added to that transport capability of camels and horses, trade was enabled over long as well as short distances. Domesticated donkeys, horses, and camels facilitated mercantile capitalism, that is the first form of capitalism, and based on simple swindling. That is, the merchant cap is the only one that knows the value of an object on both ends of the trade, and swindles both the seller and the buyer, squeezing his profit accordingly. True capitalism is based on the extraction of value from the labor power of workers assembled at machinery on a factory bench. This pastoralism of donkeys and camels came naturally from a system that used already domesticated animals such as sheep, horses, and cattle. Previously, these animals had been raised mainly as sources of meat. Then they became important for the products they provided, like wool, fur, hides, and milk, and finally now as beasts of burden. This vital aspect came to include cattle for work in the fields after the appearance of the wooden plow, the ard, and donkeys for the transportation of goods. Now, sheep for wool cloth also increasingly replaced plant fiber in linen textile production. The expansion of sheep farming affected agricultural field layout as more pasturage was allotted for animals. Convertible land use became common practice in the hilly flanks and mountainous zones around Mesopotamia. The relative decline in the cultivation of flax for linen freed land for the growth of cereals and for raising sesame, as sesame was a profitable replacement for flax and linen because it provided oil. Therefore, sesame became important in the textile industry. Wool became an essential element in the maintenance rations provided to slaves, along with barley. The establishment of this wool cycle alongside the barley cycle gave ancient Mesopotamia its two new major industries. Moreover, wool could be exported easily, unlike perishable food products, which meant that Mesopotamia had new products to exchange with their neighbors. And that brings us to new classes. First of all are the potters. Now, the production of pottery was revolutionized by the invention of the potter's wheel in the course of the 4th millennium, which was developed in 2 stages, first a slow wheel and then a rapid one. Because of this, the shaping process was more rapid than when it had been done by hand. This reflects a shift from the domestic mode of ceramic making to the professionally specialized way. Simultaneously, and for the same reason, pottery kilns were improved. Ceramics reflected the intensification of class division. Pottery for commoners was coated with slip to smooth the surface. Decoration became less complex until there was none. Painted pottery was first made for the upper ATC strata
And then the classes. There was the introduction on painted ware of incisive decoration in the form of lozenge patterns or grid lines. Archaeology in the Uruk period proves that large quantities of pottery from professionally specialized craftspeople within their own residential districts reached new levels of mass production to service the larger population. Cheaper, mass-produced ceramics intended for multiple usage were the norm. However, the Uruk diagnostic are the hand-molded beveled rim bowls. Now, the metalsmiths. Metallurgy evolved in the Uruk period from the copper working of the Ubaid. Alloying copper with tin created bronze, with a melting point lower than copper, giving a stronger weapon and/or tool. In the 3rd millennium BC, Mesopotamian artisans had a high level of mastery of metalworking, proven by their experimentation with different alloys, and we see the emergence of new molding and gilding techniques. Uruk period metallurgists were the best in the Near East. Mesopotamia needed to import metal from Iran or Anatolia, which facilitated long-distance trade in the 4th millennium BC. And we come to the builders, society, and innovation. In architecture, the developments of the Uruk period were considerable, as demonstrated by the structures created in the Anu district during the late Uruk period. For our purposes, we need to note that during the late Uruk period, the soon-to-be classic struggle among the slavocrats got underway. The big boss, which is to say the military dictator of the empire, began to recognize the challenge that came from the enemy within. In other words, his district bosses. And they might begin to think that they could get away with a coup d'etat and take the entire imperial pie for themselves. And some of them undoubtedly would think that, and if they had the cash, they would try to do it. Now, to prevent this, the boss needed to drain the financial resources possessed by potential challengers. A tried and soon-to-be proven way to do this was to keep the slave labor of the district bosses occupied in a way that did not provide cash to their masters, because, armed with cash, these bosses would always be plotters. Thus there was an explosion of building projects. Along the way came architectural innovations, unprecedented in scale, and new construction methods. For example, the builders perfected the use of molded mud brick as a building material, and the use of more solid terracotta bricks became widespread. They also began to waterproof the bricks with bitumen and to use gypsum as mortar. Some building was in limestone quarried 30 miles west of Uruk, where gypsum and sandstone were also mined. Now, 2 new types of decoration came into use in the empire, notably painted pottery cones to make mosaics diagnostic of the Iana district in Uruk, semi-engaged columns, and fastening studs. 2 standardized forms of molded mud brick appeared in these buildings. First of all, little square bricks, which were easy to handle, and secondly, large bricks used to make terraces. The larger bricks were used in big public buildings construction projects, especially in the city of Uruk. The smaller bricks were used for decorative niches and projections that became diagnostic features of Mesopotamian architecture thereafter. Now, the layout of the buildings was also novel, since they did not constitute the tripartite plan inherited from the Ubaid period. Buildings in the Iana district had labyrinthine plans with elongated halls of pillars within a rectangular building. The architects and artisans who worked on these sites displayed a high level of creativity. In any case, the wheel spread extremely rapidly in the Uruk period from wherever invented. Vehicles could transport larger loads. There were chariots in southern Mesopotamia at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. Their wheels were solid blocks. Spoked wheels were not invented until 2000 BC. The domestication of the donkey was initially more useful than wheeled vehicles as a means of transport in the long-distance trade conducted through the mountainous regions and hilly flanks of Southwest Asia before the spoked wheel was invented. The donkey enabled a system of caravans that would dominate trade in the Near East for the following millennia. At the local and regional level in Lower Mesopotamia, boats made from reeds and wood were crucial because of the importance of the rivers for connecting places and because they were capable of carrying much larger loads than land transport. Now this brings us to the second phase of the stage of slavery, the Jemdet Nasser period from 5100 to 4900 BP. Now the Jemdet Nasser name comes from an archaeological culture in south-central Iraq. There its type site is Tel Jemdet Nasser. It is a proto-historical period as writing existed sporadically in Mesopotamia at this time. The Jemdet Nasser period is the autochthonous next phase in the evolution of the slave stage in Mesopotamia, and radiocarbon absolute dating on this period ranges from 5100 to 4900 BP. In Upper Mesopotamia at this time we have the early Ninevite V period, and in addition Jemdet Nasser is contemporaneous with the Proto-Elamite period in Iran. Socio-culturally, the Jemdet Nasser phase features the master-mistress classes consolidating their dictatorship. Archaeologically, the main diagnostic is the painted monochrome and polychrome pottery with geometric and figurative designs. The latter display trees, birds, fish, goats, scorpions, and snakes. The archaeological evidence, in this case the Jemdet Nasser painted pottery, proves the socio-cultural evolutionary conclusion, as the diagnostic artifacts constitute a small percentage of the total ceramic assemblage. In other words, the diagnostic painted pottery was a special ware made for the ruling classes and their consigliori. At the type site of Jemdet Nasser, the painted pottery is exclusive to the large administrative central building, as it is at the Hamrin Mountains bureaucratic buildings of Tel Farah and Tel Guba. Now the Jemdet Nasser period features the next stages of the Cuneiform Script, after those of Uruk, where the script had undergone significant changes from its original pictographs. In the Jemdet Nasser period, cuneiform adopted simpler and more abstract designs. Diagnostic is the appearance of the wedge shape. The language is Sumerian. Without exception, the subject matter of the Cuneiform Script texts is administrative, specifically the rationing of foodstuffs and taxable listing of objects and animals. Two different counting systems were in use. A numeral system with a base of 60, called the sexagesimal system, that was used for counting property in work animals and human slaves, and a bisexagesimal system for rations in grain, cheese, and fresh fish. Literary genres like hymns and king lists, which became very popular later in Mesopotamian history, have not yet emerged. Archives of all of these scripts have been found at Tel Ukar, Tel Kafacha, and Uruk. The ruling class had bureaucrats in centralized buildings using cuneiform tablets and cylinder seals to account for taxes and tribute, regulating all aspects of the economy, including the rationing of foodstuffs. The surrounding settlements featured districts for craft specialists and their families, and then there were the free farmers in agricultural districts competing with slave-run latifundia. The economy was structurally tripartite: field crop agriculture, sheep and goat animal husbandry, and incipient long-distance exchange trade in precious stones and exotic trade goods. On the other hand, the homogeneity of the utility ware across the southern Mesopotamian plain proves intensive contacts and trade between cities and towns. The archaeology includes a document at Jemdet Nasser that lists several of these towns, including Ur, Uruk, and Larsa. And we come to the third phase of the stage of slavery, what's called the early dynastic period. And this is an archaeological culture in Iraq dated 4900 to 4350 BP. It is the third autochthonous phase of the socio-cultural evolution of the Mesopotamian slave stage. Here, cuneiform evolved into true writing. The greed of the slavocrats led to the breakup of centralized city-state areas of authority into a multitude of smaller slave-based polities. These city-states shared a relatively homogeneous material culture, and specifically we are talking about the land of Sumer in southern Iraq and the cities of Uruk, Lagash, Umma, and Nippur. Inevitably, these would reconsolidate into larger empires, exactly as happened in every other center of the origin of slavery or civilization, as it's sometimes called, on the planet. In Mesopotamia, the reconquest happened under General Sargon, the boss of the city-state of Akkad, located east of the Tigris between contemporary Baghdad and Samarra. From Akkad, he launched his armies against all the other city-states of southern Mesopotamia in the land we call Sumer. When victorious, he called his consolidated construct the Akkadian Empire. That empire he expanded into central Iraq, taking the cities of Girsu, Eshnunna, Fajr, and Ur. Excavation and publication of the archives of Ebla have shed light on the surrounding areas of northern Iraq, western Syria, and southwest Iran. Clearly, the entire ancient Near East was an exchange network for a variety of goods. Within that network, along the way, ideological concepts naturally circulated. Now, in terms of periodization, the archaeological and linguistic literature has been reported in Christian calendar dates, so it is convenient for us to switch from our before-present system. The early dynastic period is thus reported with several variations, and I am simplifying this for you, and we shall use the dates 2900 to 2350 BC. Now, in this period, new artistic traditions developed in Lower Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions. Famous kings such as Lugalbanda, Enmerkar, Gilgamesh, and Aga ruled over Mesopotamia. There was an expansion in the use of writing. The conquests of Sargon and his successors upset the political equilibrium throughout Iraq, Syria, and Iran, and the resulting imperial construct lasted many generations into the reign of Naram-Sin of Akkad. And the conquest of Sargon and his successors upset the political... I already said that. So the conquest lasted many years into the reign of Naram-Sin of Akkad, and the subsequent transition is much harder to pinpoint within an archaeological context. Central ruling family oppression increased at the dictatorship of the military kings and brought the local commanders under tight secret police surveillance. The conditions of the free masses steadily deteriorated as the slave-run latifundia became the dominant production unit. The end of the ED is accordingly defined politically, rather than in archaeological diagnostics of the ceramic type we have been using until now. The conquest of Sargon and his successors not only upset the political equilibrium throughout Iraq, but also in Syria and Iran. Now, the intra-ruling class struggle. There were multiple fault lines within the ruling gangs. At the top of the heap was the one imperial family intermarried within itself to keep power from being dispersed to outsiders. However, the empire was made up of people who had to be told what to do and when to do it. Accordingly, a boss hierarchy was essential, and inherent in such a group of bosses is the desire to become bigger than they are. If they were allowed to accumulate cash with which to finance sedition and subversion, then some of them at least would so engage. Now, the secret police were the ultimate line of defense, but they could be corrupted as well. It would be better if these district bosses never had the cash to begin with, and so the center encouraged elaborate spending by them on a variety of pleasures to keep this class of parasites broke and in debt. Another way of keeping the hierarchy from getting their hands on money was to keep the source of that cash busy, doing something other than engaging in the production of money from crops or mines or articles for sale. The construction of monumental architectural undertakings like ziggurats or pyramids was socially acceptable direction for the district bosses' labor reserves that required only the support of the priests and priestesses. The religious bosses continued to be a necessary evil and unavoidable even after the ATC stage. So altogether, we have a complex set of antagonistic contradictions within the ruling class itself, and we will be discussing this again in the context of the Nile River in the next lecture, when we move on to the same topic, same period, same socio-cultural evolutionary stages along the Nile in ancient Egypt.